The February morning, I carried 400 cracked eggs home in the back of my grandfather's truck. The temperature was 11 degrees and the heater core had been leaking antifreeze since November. I drove with the window cracked so the fumes wouldn't put me to sleep, and the cold came in sideways and settled into the collar of my grandfather's old Carhartt coat like it had always lived there. I had spent $6. The man at Decker's feed auction, a big man, red-faced, who sold surplus and distressed inventory out of a corrugated metal building off County Road 7, had looked at me twice when I raised my hand. The first time to confirm the bid was real. The second time to decide whether to feel sorry for me. He took my money, though. He always took the money. There were other bidders. Two of them were men I recognized. One who ran laying hens commercially out past Millhaven, and one who drove the white pickup that had been parked in our driveway twice since October, both times while someone stood on our porch trying to talk me into selling. They had bid on the eggs for half a minute, then stopped. I heard one of them laugh when the auctioneer called it. I didn't look over. The eggs were packed in 14 cardboard flats, each one stamped with a red distributor code I didn't recognize. Cracked shells, the auction listing said, cosmetic defects, unfit for retail. I had known when I saw the listing 3 days before exactly what I was going to do. I also knew I had $47 left in my operating account at Garrett County Savings, that the propane tank was at 18%, and that I had 14 laying hens and a rooster who had stopped being reliable sometime in late November. Cold stress, probably. The kind of thing you read about in old poultry handbooks and then experience yourself in a way that feels entirely personal. The farm was 63 acres in the hill country of western Maryland, just outside a town called Grantsville. My grandfather had worked it for 41 years, my grandmother for 38 of those years beside him. I had been here since September, 8 months after my grandfather's funeral, 4 months after I turned 19, and approximately 3 weeks after I understood that if I didn't come back to this place, no one would. The house was drafty. The barn roof had a soft spot over the middle bay that I hadn't told anyone about yet because I wasn't ready to hear what they'd say. The soil was good, the well was good, and there was something in this old smokehouse at the back of the property that I hadn't fully explored yet. Something my grandfather had locked in January of the previous year and never unlocked before he died. But first, the eggs. The eggs arrived on a Tuesday. That's the detail people always skip when they tell this story later, as if the day of the week doesn't matter. It matters. Tuesday meant the Garrett County Agricultural Co-op was running their midweek clearance, and the man behind the sorting table, heavyset, wearing a canvas apron that had probably been tan at some point, was moving flats of cracked and irregular eggs into a wire cart near the loading dock. He was going to pitch them. He told me so when I asked, said the restaurant accounts wouldn't take anything with a compromised shell, said the liability wasn't worth it, said he'd been throwing out 200 to 300 eggs a week since October. I asked him how much for everything in the cart. He looked at me the way men at co-ops sometimes look at me, like he was trying to figure out if I was serious or if I was going to waste his time. $6, he finally said. Whole cart. I counted before I loaded them. 411 eggs across 23 flats, not all of them cracked. Some were just small, some misshapen, some double-yolked, and too large for standard cartons. I paid with a folded 5 4/4 from the cup holder of my grandfather's 1997 Ford F-150, which I was still getting used to driving because the clutch grabbed hard in second gear. There were 2 men from the Bittinger area who watched me load the truck. I didn't know their names then, though I learned them later. One of them said something to the other that I didn't quite catch, and they both laughed. Not cruel, exactly. Just the quiet amusement of people who have already decided the outcome of a situation. I drove the 11 Meinzels back to the farm on Route 495 with the heat on low and the flats stacked in the bed, wrapped in an old moving blanket I kept there for exactly this kind of errand. I didn't have a plan yet, not a complete one. I had an idea, and I had 411 eggs, and I had a farm with a kitchen that stayed between 58 and 62 degrees in January. Because the furnace was original to 1987, and the insulation in the walls was original to considerably before that. What I knew about eggs at that point was mostly what I'd read. My grandmother had kept laying hens her whole married life, 40 years of them, but I had grown up in Cumberland, 41 miles east, and my understanding of poultry had come from books rather than practice. There's a gap between those two kinds of knowing that I was still learning to measure. What I also knew was that my 14 hens weren't laying, that the rooster had been unreliable for 2 months, and that I had a problem I couldn't solve with what I currently had. The eggs were a different kind of resource than I'd known how to think about before. I drove the 41 miles back on Route 9 with the heater running and the radio off. I needed to think. The kitchen thermometer read 59 degrees when I pushed through the back door at 2:30. I set the flats on the long table under the south window and stood there looking at them, 411 eggs. I'd counted twice at the store, once more in the truck. The shells ranged from white to deep brown to a pale greenish gray that surprised me. I hadn't expected the variety. Some had surface cracks, spiderweb fine. Others were intact but misshapen, one end too blunt, the curve off in a way that would have made them unsellable in any carton. I separated those into 2 groups without deciding to, just sorting by instinct. The thing I hadn't told Curtis Dale, the thing I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, was that I'd spent 3 weeks in November reading about incubation, not casually. I'd ordered 2 books from an agricultural press in Pennsylvania, one on heritage breed poultry, one specifically on egg viability and hatch rates, and I'd been taking notes in the back pages of my own ledger. Temperature tolerance, humidity requirements, the window of viability after collection, which is longer than most people assume if the eggs have been kept cool and unrefrigerated. The books disagreed on some things. I'd made notes on where they disagreed. What I knew from that reading was this: an egg kept between 50 and 65 degrees, unwashed, unrefrigerated, stays viable for incubation for up to 3 weeks after laying, sometimes longer. These eggs had been collected within the last 5 days, according to the teenager at the co-op who'd helped me carry them. They'd been stored in the back of the produce cooler, cool, not cold. 55 degrees, he'd guessed when I asked. That was inside the window. What I also knew was that I didn't have an incubator. Not yet. I had, however, found something in my grandmother's hay barn in October that I hadn't known what to do with at the time. It was pushed against the back wall behind 2 broken hay bales and a rusted cultivator disc, a wooden cabinet, homemade, roughly 2 feet square, with a hinged glass front and a thermostat dial mounted to the side that said Hova Bator in faded letters below a range of 95 to 105 degrees. Someone had built a wooden housing around a commercial wafer thermostat. My grandmother's handwriting was on a piece of masking tape stuck to the inside of the glass. March 1974, 23:30. 23 hatched out of 30 tried, 76% in 1974, with a homemade cabinet and a dial thermostat. I'd left it in the barn because I didn't know if it still worked. I'd left it there the way you leave something you're not ready for. Now I pulled on my coat and went to find out. The barn was 31 degrees that night. I know because the thermometer I'd zip-tied to the doorframe in November read 31 when I pushed the door open with my shoulder, and my breath came out in a hard white plume that the lantern light caught and dissolved. The cabinet was where I'd left it, pushed back behind the cultivator disc, which had a 1/4 inch of frost along its upper edge. I dragged it out by its base. It was heavier than I expected, maybe 40 pounds, and the wood was old-growth pine gone dark with age. The joints still tight. Someone had built it to last. Someone had thought carefully about airflow, about insulation. There was a layer of what looked like newspaper packed between an outer shell and an inner liner, and when I held the lantern close, I could read fragments of the date. January 11, 1973. A year before the tape inside the glass. A year of building before a year of hatching. The heating element was a single incandescent bulb socket, 25 watts wired to the wafer thermostat through a ceramic standoff. The cord was cloth-wrapped, the old kind, and one section near the plug had electrical tape wound around it in a way that told me someone had spliced it at some point. Careful work, not panicked work. There was a small pan welded from sheet metal sitting on the floor of the cabinet for water, for humidity. There were 2 wooden dowels set at different heights for egg trays that weren't there anymore. I carried it to the house. I set it on the kitchen table and plugged it in and stood back. The bulb came on. I watched the thermostat. It took 11 minutes. I timed it on my phone for the interior temperature to climb from 31 degrees to 99. I had an instant red meat thermometer I used for canning, and I held the probe inside the cabinet through the hinged glass front and watched the numbers settle 99.4. I adjusted the dial a fraction counterclockwise, 99.1. I left it there. For the next 3 hours, I checked it every 20 minutes. It held within half a degree. The wafer thermostat clicked on and off in a quiet rhythm, almost like breathing. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at the table with my notebook and wrote down everything: time, temperature, humidity reading from the small gauge I clipped inside, the ambient temperature in the kitchen as the wood stove cycled. My grandmother had written one line of data on a piece of masking tape. I had 4 pages of notes before midnight. The eggs were still at the grain elevator. The cabinet was holding temperature. I had found her egg-turning records somewhere in a kitchen drawer in November, a small spiral notebook, the kind that costs 50 cents, and I went to get it now. The notebook was small enough to fit in a coat pocket. The cover was red, or had been. It had faded to the color of old brick, and the spiral binding was rusted at 3 of the coils so that the pages didn't lie flat. I set it beside my own notebook on the kitchen table and opened it to the first page. Her handwriting was different from the journal's, faster, less careful. The letters leaned forward like they were in a hurry. At the top of the first page she had written, Ink Spring, 1974. Underlined twice, and below that, in smaller letters, Cabinet 2, Buff Orpington Cross, 84 eggs, set March 14. 84 eggs. I pressed my finger against the number. She had recorded turns twice daily, morning and evening, marked with a small in the left margin, temperature in the right margin, written in pencil that had faded to the edge of legibility. I could read most of it. Day 1 through day 7, 99 degrees every entry. Day 8, a note. Fan chain slipping, rigged with rubber band from jar lid seems to hold. Day 12. Candled this evening, 71 developing, 13 clear, removed. She had done the math in the corner. 83% fertility. I turned the pages carefully, the way you handle something that knows it's old. The entries got shorter as the weeks went on, the way a person's handwriting gets when they're tired and confident at the same time. By day 18, she had written only numbers by day 20. Lockdown, humidity up, waiting. Then a single line 2 days later. First pip, 11 p.m. And the page after that, the hatch results, 61 chicks. 73% hatch rate from fertile eggs. She had underlined that number, too. I sat with that for a while. 61 chicks from 84 set, the arithmetic of patience. She had done this in a kitchen that was probably colder than mine, with a cabinet she had likely built or repaired herself, with a rubber band holding the fan in place. My cabinet was holding at 99.1. My humidity gauge read 63%. I was 400 eggs short of anything hatching. I wrote her numbers into my own notebook next to mine, column beside column. Her eggs, my eggs. Her temperature, my temperature. The rubber band, my half-turn of a dial, at 11. 40 I put on my barn coat over my flannel and went out to check the livestock. Frost on the truck windshield, the goats were settled. The 3 hens I still had were on the roost, making the small sounds chickens make when they're warm and half asleep. Sounds like water running slow over smooth stones. I stood in the barn doorway for a minute. The incubator was running back in the house. The eggs were still in town. Tomorrow I needed to go get them. I was up before 5. The kind of dark that isn't just absence of light, but has actual weight to it, pressing on the windows. I made coffee in the percolator my grandfather had used, a battered aluminum thing with a glass knob on the lid, bought sometime in the late 60s, and stood at the kitchen counter watching the incubator's temperature display. 99.2, close enough. The drive into Harlan was 41 minutes on a clear morning. On a February morning with patchy black ice on Route 9 and the sun not fully up, it was closer to 55. I left at 6:15 with the truck heater running and a cardboard flat in the passenger seat, the kind egg farmers use, 12 by 12 cells. I had 4 of them. I didn't know exactly how I was going to transport 400 cracked eggs 41 miles without losing half of them to sloshing, but I had brought a spool of packing tape and a roll of bubble wrap, and I figured I would work it out when I got there. Caldwell's Feed and Supply opened at 7. I pulled in at 7:08, the gravel lot still mostly empty. There was one other truck, a green Ram, mid-90s, with a cracked rear windshield held together with a strip of clear tape that someone had applied so carefully it almost looked deliberate. I recognized it, but couldn't place it. Inside, it smelled like molasses and sawdust and the specific cold that old tin-roofed buildings hold even when they have a space heater running. A woman I didn't recognize was behind the counter, maybe 50, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. I told her I was there for the cracked eggs. She looked at me the way people sometimes did, taking in my age, my grandfather's barn coat, the bubble wrap under my arm. She didn't say anything dismissive. She just nodded and said they were in the back cooler and asked how I was planning to carry them. I showed her the flats and the tape. She considered this for a moment, then disappeared and came back with a roll of paper towels and a half-empty bag of dried pine shavings. She said if I layered the shavings between the eggs and the flat, they'd ride better than bubble wrap, more give. She said she used to hatch turkeys. I didn't ask her anything else. I just said thank you and meant it. She helped me load the eggs, all 412 of them. Some were barely cracked, a hairline, barely visible unless you tilted them to the light. Others had been cracked badly enough that the membrane was doing the real work. Those I handled with 2 hands. We worked mostly in silence, the 2 of us passing eggs from the cooler shelf to the flat. When we were done, my hands were cold through and smelled faintly of limestone. She rang me up, $6.22. I drove home in second gear the whole way, not because the truck required it. It didn't. The roads were dry and the grade was gentle, but because I didn't trust myself at speed with 412 eggs stacked in the flatbed. I had the flats wedged between a bag of scratch grain and the spare tire, shavings layered between each row the way she'd shown me, and I still took every corner like I was carrying nitroglycerin. It was 11 miles from the co-op back to the farm on County Road 7, and I drove all 11 of them with both hands on the wheel and my jaw set. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The flats didn't move. When I pulled into the yard, I sat in the truck for a minute before getting out. The chickens were already making noise from inside the coop, which meant it was close to their afternoon feeding, and they could hear the truck and had opinions about the delay. I had 4 Baird rocks, 2 Rhode Island Reds, and a hen of uncertain heritage that my grandfather had always called Incident, and Incident in particular had opinions about schedules. I carried the flats inside 2 at a time, setting each one on the workbench I'd cleared that morning. The incubator was running. I'd plugged it in the night before to let the temperature stabilize, checked it twice before I left, and checked it again when I got back. It was reading 99.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which was close enough to acceptable that I didn't adjust the dial. Humidity was lower than I wanted, at 42%. I put a shallow dish of water near the vent and watched the number begin to climb. Then I sat down on the stool and looked at the eggs. They were ugly. There was no other word. Some of them were streaked from where the shell had wept slightly through the crack, leaving a faint mineral stain in the shape of a river delta. Some had been taped at the hatchery. I could see the thin strips of what looked like surgical tape across the worst fractures, and some had no visible damage at all except a single line fine as a hair, running from crown to equator. I held one of the better ones up to the work light. The shell glowed faintly amber where it was thinnest near the crack. I had read everything I could find in 3 days. Cracked eggs could hatch. The membrane was the real barrier. As long as the membrane was intact, the crack itself was manageable if you sealed it before bacteria could enter. And before the egg lost too much moisture, the sealing material mattered. Most sources said beeswax, some said paraffin. One forum post from a woman in rural Tennessee said she'd used plain white candle wax in a pinch and hatched 14 out of 16. I had found half a block of beeswax in my grandfather's workshop in a coffee tin labeled in his handwriting. For grafting, for leather, for whatever needs it. I melted a small piece of the beeswax in a tin can set inside a pot of hot water on the kitchen stove. My grandfather had done the same thing. I suspected the bottom of the coffee tin was darkened in a ring from exactly this kind of improvised double boiler. The wax went from opaque and hard to clear and liquid in about 4 minutes. I kept the flame low. Too hot and the wax would smoke. Too cool and it would congeal before I could work it into the crack. I had set up a station at the kitchen table, the work light clamped to the edge, A clean dish towel folded into a square, a bamboo skewer I'd sharpened to a fine point with the belt sander. 47 eggs needed sealing that first night. I had sorted them into 3 groups: minor fractures, moderate fractures, severe fractures, and I started with the minor ones because I needed practice before I touched anything fragile. The technique was this: hold the egg up to the light, locate the full length of the crack, then dip the tip of the skewer into the liquid wax and draw a line along the fracture. The wax cooled almost instantly on contact with the shell. A second pass slightly overlapping the first, a third if the crack was wide. The finished seal looked like a raised scar, pale gold against the mottled surface of the shell, and when I ran my thumbnail across it, it held. I worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. The kitchen smelled of warm beeswax and something older underneath it. Something associated with the workshop itself, linseed oil, maybe, or just the particular smell of tools that have been used for decades. By the time I reached the severe fractures, my hands had steadied. The eggs that had been taped at the hatchery I left with the tape in place and sealed over the top of it, doubling the barrier. 3 eggs in that group I set aside entirely. The membrane on each of those was visibly dented inward at the fracture site, which meant pressure had already stressed it. I didn't throw them away. I set them in a separate carton and labeled it with a piece of masking tape. Uncertain. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees. The incubator was running in the back bedroom, the one my grandfather had used as a storage room for seed catalogs and the kind of paperwork nobody ever needs, but nobody throws away either. I had cleared a path to the outlet, run a thermometer probe inside, and spent most of the previous afternoon getting the temperature stable at 9.5. It had drifted twice overnight before it settled. I carried the sealed eggs through the house in small batches, careful on the uneven floor between the kitchen and the hallway. The incubator hummed. The temperature read 99.7, close enough for the first night. The first 3 days I barely slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Every time I woke, my first movement was to the doorway of that back bedroom to check the display on the incubator. The temperature held through the first night, dipped to 98.9 on the second morning, and I adjusted the dial by the smallest increment I could manage, less than a quarter turn, and watched it climb back. By the third evening, it had settled to 99.4 and stayed there. I turned the eggs twice a day, morning and evening, rotating each one 180 degrees and marking the turn side with a small tinsel X so I wouldn't lose track. The ones with sealed cracks I turned more carefully, 2 hands instead of 1, setting each back down with the crack angled slightly upward. I had read that orientation could reduce weeping through a compromised shell. I didn't know if it would help. I did it anyway. On day 7, I candled them for the first time. I had borrowed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and taped a toilet paper roll over the lens, narrow the beam the way I'd seen described in one of my grandfather's poultry pamphlets. A mimeographed sheet, faded to near illegibility, that I'd found folded inside the back cover of the notebook. In the dark of the bedroom, I held each egg against the tube and watched. In a good egg, you could see the spiderweb of blood vessels spreading from a dark central mass, faint and branching, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Clear eggs showed nothing, just a uniform glow. Dead eggs, the pamphlet said, showed a blood ring, a ring that had spread and then collapsed on itself when the embryo stopped. I went through all 41 eggs over the course of an hour. 31 showed vessels, 2 showed rings. 8 were unclear. The cracks or the tape made it impossible to read what was inside. I set the 2 blood ring eggs on the counter. 31, developing 31. Out of 41 eggs that had arrived, cracked and cold and stacked in a cardboard flat on a truck that had sat on a highway shoulder for 6 hours in December. I stood in the dark room for a moment after I finished, the flashlight off, the incubator humming its low continuous sound, the temperature probe blinking its green number, 31. Outside, sleet had started. I could hear it against the window glass, a dry clicking sound, irregular, the kind of weather that made the farmhouse feel more itself somehow, the walls more present, the insulation in the ceiling more meaningful. I went back to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and wrote the number 31 in my notebook with the date beside it. December 12th, Thursday. Then I looked at the carton I'd labeled uncertain. and decided they deserved one more week before I gave up on them. The sleet was still going when I woke up the next morning. Friday the 13th, I noticed the date on my phone when I checked the temperature reading from the incubator's external probe, 99.4 Fahrenheit, which was exactly where I wanted it. I had learned not to be superstitious about dates. The land didn't care what the calendar said. I turned the eggs at 6:30, again at noon, again just before dark. That was the rhythm now. Every 8 hours, both hands, slow rotation, a quarter turn, noting any that felt different in weight or surface temperature. 3 times a day I was in that spare room. I had stopped thinking of it as a chore somewhere around day 5. It had become more like checking on something that was already happening or without me, I was just the witness. On December 14th, a Saturday, the old woman from the next farm over came by with a container of soup. She had been doing this roughly once a week since October, when she'd decided without asking that I wasn't feeding myself properly. She wasn't wrong. She stood in the kitchen while I heated it on the gas burner and asked how the eggs were coming. I told her 31 were developing. She set down her mug. Out of how many? 41 viable after float testing. 45 after I pulled the ones that were fully cracked through. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good number," she said finally. "Better than I'd have guessed from what you paid for them." I didn't tell her what I'd paid. I didn't need to. She already thought the whole thing was impractical. That was fine. She'd thought the same about the Dominiques in the fall, and now those birds were laying 11 eggs a day between them. The 8 uncertain eggs stayed in the incubator through day 10. On the morning of December 16th, I candled them again, one by one, in the same dark room, same flashlight, same angle. 2 of the 8 had developed since my last look, faint vessels now visible, traceable, real. 6 remained unreadable. I left all 8 in. There was no cost to leaving them. The incubator had room, 33 developing now. I wrote that in the notebook too, with the date and the time, 7:14 a.m., and a small note in the margin. Don't count them yet. That was the hardest part of incubation. Not the turning, not the temperature management, not even the candling. It was the waiting without counting. The math was always there in the back of my mind, the conversion. If 33 hatched, if even 25 made it through the first week, if half of those were pullets. But I had learned that math like that was just a way of spending money you hadn't earned yet. I closed the notebook and went out to feed the goats. The goats were restless that morning. The smaller one, the Nubian doe with the torn ear, had been off her feed since the previous afternoon, and I crouched in the pen with her for 20 minutes before I understood why. She was bagging up, her udder tight and warm, the skin taut in a way it hadn't been at my evening check. I hadn't expected her until late January. I went back inside and looked at the calendar I kept tacked to the inside of the barn door, where I'd written her breeding date in pencil. Counting forward, she wasn't early. I had miscounted by 3 days when I first wrote the estimate. She was exactly on time. I moved her into the kidding stall before 8 o'clock, spread fresh straw, filled the water bucket, brought the heat lamp down from its hook and clamped it to the rail, then watched the temperature settle at the thermometer I'd zip-tied to the fence. Post, 41 degrees outside, 56 inside the stall with the lamp running. Good enough, she kidded at 11:20 that morning. 2 does, which I had not let myself predict. I wrote the time in the notebook, the weights, 4 pounds 2 ounces and 3 pounds 11 ounces on the kitchen scale I'd carried out wrapped in a towel, and the observation that both kids were on their feet within 22 minutes. I wrote, both nursing by noon. Then I sat back on the straw and let myself breathe for a moment. It occurred to me, sitting there with straw in my hair and afterbirth on my barn coat, that I had not thought about the eggs in 4 hours. That was the first time since the incubator went on that any stretch of the morning had passed without my calculating, recalculating, checking the temperature log, adjusting the mental arithmetic. The goats had pulled me entirely into the present tense. I think that's what the farm did best. Kept you in the present tense. There was always something that needed your full attention right now, this hour before the weather changed, or the temperature dropped, or the animal in front of you moved from stable to urgent. The future was always there, pressing, but the work kept interrupting it. I checked on the eggs that afternoon, steady at 99.7 degrees. Humidity at 61%, which was where I wanted it in the final week before lockdown. I had 9 days until the earliest expected hatch date, which I had marked on the calendar with a small circle in red pen, December 26th, one day after Christmas. I closed the incubator and went back to check on the doe and her kids. The smaller of the two had found the teat again on her own. She was pulling hard, her small tail flagging back and forth in the lamplight. I counted that as a good sign. December 26th came on a Wednesday. I was awake before 4, not because I had set an alarm, but because I had not really slept. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle in the cold, and then got up, put on my grandfather's coat, and walked across the yard with a flashlight. I heard them before I opened the incubator lid. A thin, persistent sound, not quite a peep, more like the beginning of one, a sound that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. I stood very still with my hand on the lid and just listened. Then I opened it. 11 eggs had pipped. The shells had small starred openings where the chicks inside had broken through the membrane and tasted air for the first time. I counted the holes twice. 11. I closed the lid and sat down on the floor of the barn with my back against the wall, and my knees pulled up, and I did not move for a long time. By evening, there were 23 chicks in the brooder box under the heat lamp. By the morning of the 28th, there were 41. The hatch continued through the 29th, slowing and then stopping. Final count. 47 chicks from 400 cracked eggs in December on a farm with no climate-controlled hatchery. Using a second-hand incubator I had paid $60 for in September 47. I had paid $6 for the eggs and $60 for the machine. $66 total. By April, those birds would begin laying. By May, at standard production rates for the breed, I would have enough eggs weekly to supply the farmer's market stand I had already reserved a space at. $22 for the season, paid in November when I still wasn't sure any of this would work. I wrote all of this down in my notebook the morning of the 29th. The numbers, the dates, the cost, the count. I wrote it next to the page where I had written down what the man at the co-op said in October about December hatching and dead money and learning hard lessons. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like something had been confirmed that I had been waiting a long time to confirm, that patience is a form of knowledge, and that the work itself will teach you if you're willing to stay in the room. If you've been told you're too young or too soft, or that the thing you're trying to do doesn't make sense in the season you're trying to do it, I want you to know that the eggs don't know your age. The animals don't read the calendar the way other people read it. The land doesn't care who doubts you. It only asks whether you showed up. I hope you'll subscribe, and I'd like to hear your story in the comments. Whatever's waiting in the barn, it's worth opening the door.